Okay, so I think it's finally time I address the Yu-Gi-Oh audience on my channel. So first off, thanks for 1,000 subscribers. I have no idea how I hit this milestone because I left the channel in 2019 with like 850, give or take. And then I don't post anything for 5.5 years, and I got 200 more. So thanks, but why? Speaking of why, let's talk about where I've been during that time. So toward the end of my Yu-Gi tubing days, I think it became abundantly clear that I had lost interest in Yu-Gi-Oh competitively. One of the last videos I made was about Firewall Dragons banning in late 2018, but by that point the damage had already been done. I was looking to move on from the game, but I had no idea how to do that because Yu-Gi-Oh was really the only game I'd played up to that point, and I'd been playing it since 2010. Not helping was the fact that the world shut down only a year and a half after that, so finding a new TCG hobby was difficult to say the least. I dabbled in Gate Ruler, Vanguard, Magic, Pokemon, Alestrals, Grand Archive, and much, much more actually. But I didn't really settle on any of them. Magic was the one that got me the most excited, but it's not in the best place competitively as of the recording of this video, so I'm looking more into Pokemon. Did you know competitive Pokemon decks cost $50? But there was something else. Something I'd been working on by myself in the background basically since my Yu-Gi-Oh channel died in 2019. And today is the day I finally showcase it to the rest of the world. Introducing Spiritbrawl. Well, the beta at least. So, what is Spiritbrawl? It's a TCG of my own design. You start with 20 life points, or spirit as it's called in this game, and your goal is to reduce your opponent's spirit down to 0. Pretty simple. You start with a 50 to 60 card main deck and no extra deck. Get that 20 card starting hand nonsense out of here. Your main deck consists of 3 core card types: monsters, runes, and schemes. Monsters have some special variations that I'll explain in a little bit. Monsters are what you'll use to do battle with your opponent. Spells are powerful effects you can use during your turn. And schemes are powerful effects you can use during your opponent's turn. Now I know what you're thinking. This all sounds pretty standard so far. What makes Spiritbrawl unique? Let's talk about those monster variations I was alluding to earlier. There are 3 kinds you'll find in one of the 10 starter decks I created for the game: heroes, villains, and evolutions. Heroes are half monster, half rune. Their rune text box is on the top, and their monster effect text box is on the bottom. Villains are similar, except they're half monster, half scheme. Scheme effect on the top, monster effect on the bottom. Evolutions are a bit unique. They take advantage of the Spirit Drive summoning mechanic. Basically what this is you take a certain number or specification of monsters. In the case of Lord Lucifer, you take 3 dark monsters with different names, stack them on top of each other, forming what's called a soul, and then Spirit Drive the evolution on top of the soul. Spiritbrawl also takes frustrating design elements from other TCGs and just does away with them entirely. Specifically from Yu-Gi-Oh, because that's the game I spent the most time playing. There are 3 design spaces I want to specifically mention here: negation, hand traps, and floodgates. Let's go in order. Negation is present in many card games, and it is by far the least balanced in Yu-Gi-Oh. Because Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't have an inherent cost system like almost every other game, the person going first has an incredibly unfair advantage when it comes to setting up negates. If the first player is able to set up a critical mass of them, then their opponent just can't resolve a single card in their hand. This is why many current Yu-Gi-Oh card designs simply have the clause, "this card can't be negated." It was to fix this awful oversight. Negation only exists in Spiritbrawl as a downside to your own card's powerful effect, like negating your own monster's effect when you summon it back from the graveyard by a card effect. This negation problem doesn't exist in a game like Magic because, well, you have to actually pay a cost to activate almost every single card in Magic. In fact, one of the most hilariously broken Magic cards of all time is just a negate that you can spend life on instead of mana. And if that sounds familiar to you Yu-Gi-Oh players, it absolutely should, because that's basically a hand trap. Speaking of which, let's talk about hand traps now. So in theory, I actually like the design idea of hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh, but there are two big problems that plague almost all of them in practice. They're either floodgates or negates. But then I started thinking of the term more literally. What if traps were hand traps? Well, that's essentially what every scheme in Spiritbrawl is. All schemes have two effects, a rushed effect and a perfected effect. During your turn, you can set a scheme from your hand to your back row, and on the next turn, you can activate it for either its rushed or its perfected effect. However, if you want to use it straight from your hand on your opponent's turn, you absolutely can. You can just only use the rushed effect in that case. So for this Thorn Wall, you can only activate it when your opponent declares an attack. As a rushed effect, you can destroy the attacking monster, or as a perfected effect, you can destroy all attack position monsters your opponent controls. And cards in Spiritbrawl are much easier to attack when they're in the back row, and almost impossible to interact with when they're in your hand. So keeping schemes in your hand for their rushed effect is almost guaranteed, while putting them face down and trying to use their perfected effect is much riskier, but their effects are usually much more powerful. Not always, though. In the case of this Burn My Memories, the rushed and perfected effect are exactly the same, but the rushed effect has an additional cost. And in other cases, like this Falling Empire, the rushed and perfected effect are again the same, but this time the perfected effect has an additional benefit.
Okay, so with those two design spaces discussed, that just leaves one.
Floodgates. I feel like this one is pretty unanimous, right? For Yu-Gi-Oh! Floodgates just suck. Maxi, Skill Drain, There Can Be Only One, Mystic Mine, Kaiser Coliseum, Imperial Order, Anti-Spell Fragrance, Dimensional Fissure, Droll and Lockbird, Zombie World, Dimensional Shifter, Macrocosmos, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like with negates, they provide a massive advantage to the player going first, because in Yu-Gi-Oh, again, you just don't have costs associated with your cards, so you can just play as many floodgates as you want. Floodgates are just not meant for fast games, and Magic actually also confirms this, because stacks decks don't really exist in slower formats for Magic, like think Pauper, Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, whereas for Legacy and Vintage, stacks decks are cornerstones of the format because of the speed of the format. And I'm not saying the fix to all this is to just have costs associated with all your cards, just so we could have cards like these. Far from it. In fact, the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have any inherent costs for any of its cards is probably the best part about the game. Anyway, my point is that there are no floodgates in Spiritbrawl. If any of the ideas I've mentioned throughout this video sound interesting to you and you'd like to help me further the development of Spiritbrawl, then there's a Discord server link in the description of this video where you can find out how to play Spiritbrawl on Tabletop Simulator, which is how I've been showcasing it throughout this entire video, and discuss the game and card design with me.